The day comes when scientists in one of the biotechnology laboratories begin to clone famous personalities for very large fees, of course. In fact, many rich people would like to have a child of a genius like Vivaldi, Galileo, or Michelangelo. Soon, however, people decide to take a swing at something far more valuable: God himself. After Lucifer rebelled against the power of God in heaven, he was defeated by the archangel Michael, and flaming meteor was thrown into the underworld, where he had to remain in chains and punishing flames. Michael himself chained him to a rock and cried out to return as a humble angel, to which Lucifer replied that he would rather reign in hell than serve in paradise, and he threatened that he would return as ruler of the world. Over time, Lucifer was joined by numerous demons as he craved revenge. Meanwhile, on earth, Lucifer's disciples set up a temple at the site of his fall into the abyss, and they believe that one day he will return to rule on earth. Our time. Laura Milton, an American student, is trying to persuade her professor to accept her thesis on the theme that there are no evil or good spirits, but he refuses, offering to discuss the subject in an intimate setting. But now the girl refuses. At the same time, a rare exhibition begins at the museum, the Shroud of Turin, which contains the DNA of Jesus and is a record of the fact of his resurrection. Everything is on display. Laura enters the museum after receiving a pass, a badge from a priest she knows. Marconi explains that Christ was wrapped in the shroud the day he died, but that when he rose from the dead, his body shone so brightly that his imprint remained on the cloth. Thus, the shroud is a picture of Jesus. The priest then escorts Laura to the statue of the Archangel Michael, who has been brought to the museum to guard the shroud. The War of the Angels was the first war and the first evil, but Laura disagrees. Evil is not an external mystical force, it is a personality, and when trouble happens to loved ones, it is foolish to blame the devil. But Marconi is sure that only Michael stands between the devil and men. There are many prophecies that Lucifer will return, but the father hopes that he will not find a way out. The priest leaves to go about his business, and Laura gets comfortable and begins to draw. Suddenly, she hears her name, but no one is around. She calms down and continues to work. It's evening and the gallery is about to close. The last group of tourists enters the museum, and while the guard is distracted for a moment, a figure in a black cloak separates from the group and makes his way through a side door. Despite the late hour, Laura is still working when she thinks Lucifer's head on the statue is moving, followed by the cry of a raven. The girl walks to the window without noticing the sinister figure behind her, who pulls a sword from Michael's hand and walks away. Laura closes the window and gathers her things. The guard is ready to escort her out, but she refuses. She still has to see Padre Marconi. She goes to the chapel and sees a figure in black slaying the guard with a sword. The girl runs away in terror and hides in the confessional, watching as the woman with the sword breaks the glass over the shroud. Padre Marconi arrives at the noise and, in the name of Saint Michael, demands that the sacrilege cease, but the woman throws him aside and pierces him with her sword. Laura moves carelessly and the villain notices her. She orders her underlings to take the shroud and the girl, hoping that he might like her. The bandits leave while the mortally wounded priest summons the Archangel Michael to occupy his body and defeat his enemies. Immediately, a luminous whirlwind descends from the heavens and the father comes to life. He tries to catch up with the villains, but they drive away. The plot is moved to a private auction where one of the scientists, Dr. Laurent, explains that he has managed to create a procedure by which he can grow babies from the DNA of great men, thus resurrecting the most prominent figures in the history of mankind. And as proof, he presents the reincarnation of the great Vivaldi and his proud parents. The next lot, he presents the new Michelangelo Buonarroti, and the whole rises in a burst of delight. The bidding begins when a woman in black appears in the gallery and beckons to the doctor. He rushes to her call. The pair travel to the devil's castle where the doctor sees the shroud. At last, Lucifer will have a decent home. Meanwhile, Laura is dragged into some room where several girls are already sitting in chains. All of them are horrified by what is happening and do not understand why they are there. A few men enter, take a blood test and photograph Laura, while Father Marconi, or rather the Archangel Michael in his body, makes his way to the guard room where two monks are watching the murder videos. Seeing the one who was murdered in front of them alive, they are astonished as he finds out where the keepers of the shroud were and how could they have allowed this to happen. It is explained to him that the cardinal responsible for everything is not himself at the moment. He sees secret cults and the devil's minions. and now he is in the asylum of Saint Michael. Archangel takes the car keys and drives to the cardinal's house, while the doctor isolates DNA from the blood traces on the shroud. The old cardinal meets Michael with a gun, and upon learning of what has happened becomes enraged. He warned them, but looking into the man's eyes he realizes he is not Marconi. The cardinal shows Michael Lucifer's castle and suggests that his minions intend to revive him. He reminds him the scriptures say that one day the devil will be freed from his chains and will rise from the underworld. Apparently the time has come. Two monsters are responsible for his release, a woman and an underground monster, but only Michael himself or God can set Lucifer free. The devil's minions have offered him the bodies of virgins for centuries to get a vessel for the devil, but human bodies are too weak. Although there was one woman in history who was able to bear and give birth to a son of God, and today science is ready to open the gates to the devil using Christ's DNA. Michael asks to be taken to the castle. Meanwhile, the girls try to devise an escape plan and share their experiences. It turns out that Laura's husband and son are dead. Instruments inform the doctor of a successful DNA extraction, and the walls in the underworld begin to crumble, heralding the devil's release, while the doctor informs Liz of a complete match of all the right parameters with Laura's body, and the women wait for the attendants to arrive and pounce on them. It seems that they will succeed, but another group rushes to the rescue and the girls are dragged into the laboratory. They are laid on tables, and despite desperate resistance, fertilized eggs are injected into their bodies. Liz convinces Laura to put up with it, for Lucifer is bound to like her. In the meantime, Cardinal escorts Michael to the entrance to the dungeon and warns of caution. A monster awaits ahead. At this time, the devil's minions gather in the hall with the well. Two impregnated girls are tied to a pillar in the center, and the monster who has come out takes them and leads them to the gateway to the underworld. The girls are put in an iron cage and lowered down, while Lucifer is already waiting for them. Sensing the approach of the possible Holy Mothers, he removes their collars and, transformed into a luminous stream, rushes towards them. The women are seized by the subterranean monsters and the stream enters one of them, but her body fails and she dies. Then the glowing worm enters Laura's body. Liz and the servants greet the living woman with delight. The choice is made. She is escorted into a glass cage where it is explained that her child will be the new Jesus. Meanwhile, Michael sneaks inside the castle and, having obtained a guard's uniform, finds the shroud and tries to find Laura. The doctor enters, but Michael rejects him and sets fire to the laboratory. He finds Laura, but the woman realizes it is not her longtime friend. She runs away. The Archangel has to run after her. He manages to drag her into a storage room where he explains who he is and finds out exactly what was being done to the woman. The couple escapes when Liz is informed that the shroud is missing. She gives an order to detain Laura at all costs, and the guards rush in after her. Laura and Michael in the meantime try to hide from the underground monster in narrow passages, but it catches up with them and attacks the Archangel. And while he wages a hard fight, Laura is grabbed by the guards. The enraged woman threatens Liz to kill herself and the child, and she orders her to be taken to a cell. Meanwhile, Michael is captured and put on a chain in the dungeon while Laura is tied to a bed. Liz is willing to do anything to keep the baby. After gathering all his strength, Michael breaks the chains and frees himself, while the castle guards search for the shroud hidden in the dungeon. The monster manages to see the Archangel descend into the underworld. After reaching the bottom, he's attacked by the imprisoned souls and discovers that Lucifer has been freed and his sword is missing. Then the demon of greed, Mammon, flies to him and announces that they will soon close the gate and Michael will remain here instead of Lucifer, and he scoffs at his foolishness to come down in a mortal body. The Archangel is chained to the rock with Lucifer's sword. Laura meanwhile sees her child in an ultrasound, and he suddenly calls out her name. The woman wakes up terrified and sees Liz nearby, who finds out what Lucifer told her, and then tells the story of a brave warrior and a tyrant who were equals. But the tyrant wanted the warrior to be his slave, but he refused, and soon he would rise up and join the fight. Laura speaks unflatteringly of the demon, for which she is slapped in the face. After which Liz explains the transformation happening to her body by the need to make it comfortable for the divine child. But the woman doesn't want to accept her imposed role as the mother of an incomprehensible creature. Meanwhile, the people who were given to Lucifer come to Michael, pronouncing the oath, "Saved one, saved all," and questioning him about his origins. Discovering that it is Michael himself, they demand proof, but Michael needs a sword. At this point, they are attacked by demons. The men flee. Laura is again visited by the worm Lucifer. He goes inside her. He speaks to her and convinces her to give birth to the baby he wants, after which she can do what she wants, even kill Liz. The woman calms down and sees herself with the baby in her arms. But one day she frees herself and terribly mutilates the guards and escapes from the ward. When she sees the consequences of her actions, she is horrified. What has been done to her? She manages to make her way to a warehouse, and after locking herself inside, she drinks a canister of chlorine. Liz finds it and promises that soon Lucifer will consume her completely and then she will find peace. But then Laura suddenly gains unprecedented strength, grabs the hated Liz and spews the contents of her stomach on her. From Laura's womb, Lucifer himself begins to speak to Liz and demands that the woman be killed as soon as he is born, and to destroy all who knows of what is happening. Laura is imprisoned in a glass sarcophagus to prevent any further attempts to kill the child, and Lucifer returns to the underworld where he sees Michael and taunts him. He offers an alliance that no one will be able to defeat, but the Archangel refuses to support the rebel. He thanks Michael for his new home, the body of Jesus himself, which will be his own. Lucifer flies away, and the Archangel suddenly realizes this is not at all what he thought. It is not the devil but God who has chosen Laura. She will give birth to Christ, not the devil's vessel. He asks the people to bring his sword, but the demons are close and the sword is heavy. But two men risk their lives to bring the weapon and Michael is set free. He dispels the demons and promises to return for his saviors. Michael returns to Earth and finds the shroud. Then he goes to Laura's sarcophagus. He is horrified to see her change and tries to tell her that this child is not evil at all. It is he who will defeat the devil. But Laura gets out and throws Michael away. Then she stands over him and tells him that the waters are already breaking. Searing jets pour out on the Archangel and he screams in pain. Losing his strength, Laura places Michael in her lap and demands that he kneel. He refuses and the woman sinks her fingers into his neck. With the last of his strength, Michael promises that the devil will not be able to control the child. He is the one who will defeat Lucifer because the blood of Christ does not flow and good is always stronger than evil. Enraged, Laura throws Michael aside and begins to destroy everything around her. But then the birth begins. The devil's followers gather in the castle courtyard while Liz takes the born baby away. Laura is thrown down the well and the monster takes a chain with a sharp tip and goes into the courtyard. Liz brings the baby out and shows it to the assembled people. The end of God's tyranny has come. She orders the people to kneel and calls upon Lucifer to receive the baptism of blood. At the same moment, the monster begins to spin his terrible weapon, crushing everyone in the courtyard. At this time, Michael comes to his senses and goes out into the yard as the doctor kisses the baby and dies under the blows. Liz carries the baby away, and Michael finds Laura, who has managed to hold onto the edge of the well, and pulls her out. The pair catch up with Liz's car, and while Laura picks up her baby, Michael calls him the God who chose his mother. He asks the woman to find the cardinal and goes to the well himself. He seals the entrance to the underworld where all the demons of hell have rushed, but the monster rejects him and opens the gates again. And then Michael detonates the explosives he set earlier. The castle explodes to the great joy of the cardinal. A bit later, the cardinal and Laura with the child in her arms come to the temple and return the shroud. And Michael descends into the underworld and frees the people who believed in him. After a while, Liz observes Cardinal and Laura with a grown boy walking through the woods, and she calls the baby Lucifer. And he turns around and shows a dark jet showing out of his nose. Then he turns away. Pretty unusual film which raises the themes of the struggle between good and evil but viewed through the prism of the scientific achievements of our time. And some doubts arise as to whether man truly understands what he is really doing. One day, an unidentified flying object lands on Earth, after which a crystalline tower grows above it. However, all attempts to make contact prove futile. Sometime later, astronaut Nico receives an offer to lead a mission on the spaceship Salvare to the presumed homeland of the object in the constellation Canis Major. A month into the journey, Nico wakes up on the spaceship, although they are still far from their destination. The spaceship's artificial intelligence, William, informs her that Earth's scientists miscalculated the system's coordinates, and now it will take about 7 more months to reach the aliens' planet. Nico orders the crew to be awakened, who are surprised by her appointment as commander. Moreover, the ship dangerously approaches Sirius, risking an accident. Meanwhile on Earth, Nico's husband Eric begins studying the artifact. On Salvare, Nico decides to bypass Sirius and orders the crew to be put back to sleep, but the crew sides with the former captain Ian and puts Nico to sleep despite her resistance. Ian directs the ship as close to Sirius as possible. The engine's power drops and it shuts down. Nico forces herself to wake up, takes manual control, and saves everyone. At this time on Earth, the alien object suddenly starts sending signals in the form of musical compositions transmitted by Eric. In space, it turns out that all communication in the sleep system on the ship are disabled. Additionally, Ian cannot accept his defeat. When they try to fix the ship together, he stabs Nico in the back. However, she pushes him into an electrically charged wire, killing him. Later, Nico informs the crew about this, which again causes scandals. In the midst of the argument, an accident occurs, causing the ship to start losing oxygen. They have only 5 hours before complete unconsciousness, and the engineer finds a nearby planet with oxygen. After some time, the crew finds a planet where a special mineral, ring woodite, containing oxygen, can be mined in caves. To fly to the planet, Nico wakes up the second pilot, CAs. Part of the crew descends to the planet and finds a cave full of the necessary crystals. While working, the engineer opens her helmet because the oxygen level is 19% and she can breathe perfectly. Finally leaving the cave, the astronauts see a rising moon they somehow missed. Nico has to command an urgent takeoff. The ones left behind see the ship take off. People think Nico abandoned them to die when a shuttle piloted by her descends nearby and the captain picks up the crew members. On Earth, Eric takes their little daughter to the artifact, where he states that the aliens might be trying to communicate. As if they wanted to do something bad, they would have done it already. Meanwhile on the ship, one of the girls, Petra, suddenly falls ill. Tests show elevated stress hormones. Nico asks to move them closer to Sirius when suddenly the temperature inside Salvare rises. The captain takes manual control but suddenly loses her vision. It turns out her stress hormones are off the charts as well. Astrobiologist Julian quickly identifies a high level of boron in her blood, checks soil samples taken from the planet, and reports that he has isolated a virus from them. The crew gathers to discuss the situation. Unexpectedly, Petra feels something growing from the back of her head. It turns out to be her nervous system, which kills her. Julian starts working on a vaccine and injects it into himself, but he realizes that he is experiencing the same symptoms as Petra and persuades a friend to throw him into space. He complies, but while working on the medicine, realizes that gamma rays kill the virus. Nico directs the ship towards Sirius, exposing the crew to radiation, which cures them. Later, Nico wakes up to loud banging and sees an injured engineer, suspecting that someone on board is hunting them. It turns out that AI William is offline for some reason. Nico and CAs carry the engineer to the infirmary when they are attacked by an alien. The crew searches the ship and tries to eject the dangerous alien into space, but it tears people apart until Nico lures it into an airlock and kills it. All this turns out to be just a bad dream. However, waking Nico up doesn't work until William finds a way to enter her dream. Seeing him, the captain realizes she must accept what happened to her first ship when she had to sacrifice part of the crew to save the rest. Nico finally says goodbye to her fallen friends to move forward. She suddenly wakes up. She is informed that they have encountered a moon along the way where fresh supplies can be obtained. Moreover, William has detected the same signal as on Earth. They look at the moon's surface and see the same alien object. The Salvare crew heads towards it. The alien object looks abandoned, and people realize it is much weaker than the one that arrived on their planet, and there are no living creatures around for some reason. Nico asks engineer Sasha to take a sample, while she and CAs inspect the surroundings and find a fragment of the artifact. At this time, Bernie is attacked by an unknown creature and bitten on the leg. He experiences pain, and his skin turns green. Meanwhile, Sasha explains to the artifact how Earth is structured when something grabs him and pulls him inside. Meanwhile, CAs and Nico find a forest covered with flowers that cause a strange feeling of euphoria. When the effect wears off, the astronauts return to the artifact, where Sasha tells them he had a strange dream. The group heads back to Salvare when they notice a spider-like creature rapidly approaching. However, the astronauts manage to escape. They go through decontamination, not noticing a small alien creature that infiltrated the ship. At this time, Sasha unexpectedly sees his doppelganger, and William suggests the idea that the artifacts are research probes, similar to those humans send to unknown planets. Suddenly, the AI starts flickering, and a fire breaks out nearby, which CAs rushes to extinguish. However, William does not appear. People try to bring the AI back online, but they fail. Sasha continues to see his doppelganger, and the engineer finds the alien. After repairs, William finally returns, but suddenly he starts seeing fires everywhere that aren't there. He initiates a protocol that splits the ship into two parts. Nico goes into open space to check the hull. Suddenly, the captain is thrown away from the ship, but as soon as Nico examines the accident site, Salvare activates an energy shield and it disappears. Alone in the cosmic void, Nico tries to establish communication. CAs does the same, although some of the crew are convinced of Nico's death. She has only 4% oxygen left when she sees Salvare passing by. Nico uses the remaining oxygen to send a signal, by which she is found. The captain explains where exactly the malfunction occurred, and the crew rushes to fix it. However, the system reports a breach in the seal. While fixing the damage, the engineer dies. However, William returns. Sasha reviews the scan results of his brain and deletes the file. Meanwhile, on Earth, Eric suggests working with the artifact using light, which leads to success. Suddenly, a door opens beneath the artifact. They send a drone inside. However, the signal is lost, and Sasha's image appears on the monitors. On the ship, Sasha eavesdrops on a conversation about the upcoming arrival in the Canis Major system and the danger of dark matter. Meanwhile, on Earth, Eric volunteers to enter the artifact. However, the signal is immediately lost. Instead, Sasha appears before Eric and leads him to an auditorium where he and Nico met 20 years ago. She recounts their first date, proving it's her. However, Eric realizes it's an alien and starts asking questions. Nico shows him calculations on a board, and Eric easily solves an unsolvable theorem on Earth when his daughter calls him. He exits the artifact and faints. Meanwhile, on Earth, the minister decides to enter the artifact with the military. Eric rushes after them upon learning this. His daughter cleverly follows him. On the ship, programmer Javier tells Sasha that their ship can direct an energy beam to destroy an entire planet if the aliens are hostile. Sasha corners Javier, ordering him to explain how to disable William and destroy the ship. His eyes turn white, and two needles emerge from Sasha's eyes, piercing Javier's eyes. Strangely, his father, the minister next to the artifact on Earth, sees all this. The artifact starts to blacken, and a massive sound wave knocks everyone down. Eric finds his unconscious daughter on the ground. Meanwhile, Salvare enters a massive dark matter cloud. People see lasers shooting past them. William notes elevated hormone levels in the entire crew. It seems dark matter increases serotonin levels. The lasers are charged hydrogen particles, and everyone is experiencing hormone effects similar to illegal substances. Sasha watches the merry crew. Later, he disables access to ship controls. His double, visible only to Sasha, suggests waking all the engineers to figure out how to disable the planet killer function. However, William's scream is suddenly heard. Meanwhile, on Earth, it turns out Jana has developed acute leukemia due to the artifact. On the ship, the malfunctioning AI William tells Sasha how to reboot him. Later, the team finds a CT scan of Sasha in deleted files and realizes he is no longer human. An alien parasite is in his brain. They hear the second pilot's screams and see strange tendrils emerging from Sasha's eyes, reaching for the pilot's eyes. Nico and CAs manage to save the pilot, lock Sasha in the control room, and activate the alarm. Nico realizes the aliens chose Sasha as the crew's killer because she treated him dismissively. Then she notices William also looks strange. He needs a backup, but those files are no longer available. On Earth, a journalist who visited the artifact agrees to an alien implant and now says the aliens are called Akaya. The energy surge was defensive, not knowing Jana had a genetic anomaly. However, the Akaya can cure her. Meanwhile, the engineer connects Salvare's cooling systems, but Sasha disconnects them again. They go back and forth until Bernie electrocutes the system and himself simultaneously, breaking all connections. Sasha then tries to cut off oxygen supply to all lower decks, but a severe headache starts. He admits it's not him, but Akaya, opposing the captain. Nico asks him to convey to the aliens that they don't want to fight, but if he kills everyone on the ship, it will force humanity to act with force. Nevertheless, he cuts off the oxygen, directing the ship towards a black hole. Nico orders an evacuation to shuttles, but plans to stay on the ship and fix the situation. After seeing everyone off, she meets AI William and begs him to return. However, Sasha attacks, grabs, and chokes her. Nico loses consciousness. She wakes up next to William and recognizes that the implant in Sasha's head has a powerful energy source. This means it could be used to generate the impulse needed for flight. Meanwhile, the crew hears Nico's voice. She reports that William is back with her and they can return. Sasha's brain has become an energy source. Soon, Salvare reaches its destination. The astronauts head towards the Akaya city but decide to land nearby. CAs and Nico reach the caves, where they spot a winged alien. Nearby is an alien AI that suddenly speaks to them in Earth's language. It turns out they've been intercepting all human signals sent into deep space for the past 100 years. The AI explains that Akaya is 427 light-years from this planet, called Zakir. It advises not to seek Akaya but to hide from them, as they only seek destruction. Meanwhile, Sasha's double mocks him, and the real Sasha wants only one thing: death. On Zakir, William contacts the planet's AI and learns there are 336 enslaved star systems in the Akaya kingdom. If Akaya had been to Earth, humanity is doomed. Sasha provokes the doctor, forcing him to destroy him. After dissecting Sasha, scientists study the Akaya implant. Trying to save the dying Javier, they insert the reprogrammed implant into his head. Meanwhile, Nico and CAs find a place littered with bones and discover an Akaya implant inside one of the skulls, similar to the one in Sasha's head. The women realize that war is inevitable and decide to destroy the Akaya probe on Zakir. Nico approaches the Zakirans, who ask for their help. One of the Zakirans, captured by the Akaya, attacks the shuttle but dies in the engine fire. Salvare, on Nico's orders, fires an energy beam at the Zakir artifact, destroying it. Suddenly, William reports the approach of 5 alien objects, identical to the one currently on Earth. In the next moment, Akaya destroys the planet Zakir. On Earth, Eric carries Jana to the artifact, asking the Akaya to save her. The artifact opens its doors. The journalist tells her followers that the Akaya want to be friends with Earth. In space, the crew of the ship is shaken by the destruction of the planet. Moreover, the debris from Zakir hits part of the ship and kills a crew member. Nico orders everyone to head to the cafeteria, and she herself goes there through the air duct. The ship's protective screen may not hold, so they need to get out of the blast wave urgently. Meanwhile, William has to confess that based on Sasha's alien implant, he created another AI, half human and half Akaya. The commander demands to destroy it, but it assures them that it is not dangerous to humans. Nico has to wake up programmer Richard, who suddenly wonders why Nico was given such an incompetent team for such an important mission. He talks to the AI, and it chooses the name Yara and changes its appearance. It knows nothing about the laws of human robotics and has no connection with Akaya, but it was humans who first destroyed the alien Akaya probe without any reason on the planet Zakir, so they will have to at least explain themselves. Meanwhile, on Earth, Eric carries Jana to the Akaya probe, where a hospital bed is immediately provided for the girl. In space, Nico can't believe in Akaya's peaceful intentions and orders the Salvare to leave immediately. However, holes appear in the ship's hull. 2 engineers go into space to repair the ship, but suddenly Akaya ships appear near the Salvare and open fire. The engineers die, and Nico wonders why didn't they finish them off. Yara contacts Akaya, who declare that they want negotiations with Nico. On Earth, the Akaya probe closes its doors, leaving Eric outside. Meanwhile, on the Salvare, Nico asks CAs to try to return to Earth because she has already started a war. Sometime later, Nico heads to the Akaya ship on her shuttle, losing contact with the Salvare. Soon, Nico sees a wonderful light ahead and enters it. Many glowing beings swirl around her until the woman suddenly finds herself near her daughter's bed. Jana wakes up and calls her, but Nico doesn't believe in the reality of what's happening. The girl talks about her illness, and the mother gives a ring. Jana runs outside where Eric meets her. Nico also runs after and suddenly finds herself in front of her mother. Nico suddenly realizes that her mother's image was borrowed by the aliens. Akaya confirmed this and asked Nico to inform Earth about their peaceful intentions. However, Nico is sure they have different understandings of good. She accuses Akaya of destroying an entire planet, but the alien reminds her that the Zakirians were killed because of Nico's actions, bombing the probe. At that moment, Yara appears next to them. Akaya accuses the AI of serving humans, grabs Yara by the throat, and pushes her back onto the Salvare, where she tells the crew what she saw. Meanwhile, Nico argues with Akaya, proving she is ready for negotiations. The simulation changes, and Nico finds herself at her daughter Jana's funeral. Eric accuses her of abandoning the family, to which Nico responds that between family and humanity, she would choose the latter. Outside the simulation, Nico sits with her eyes closed while a small spider-like robot climbs over her body. In the simulation, Eric suddenly attacks her, and Nico has to fight. She wakes up and finds herself crushing the robot. At this time, CAs finds her and takes her to the shuttle. On Earth, Jana gives her father's wedding ring to Eric. On the Salvare, they notice the appearance of Akaya's ships, so Richard orders to prepare for light speed and asks Yara for help, promising to disable her control. Meanwhile, Nico and CAs see the ship taking off, leaving the women on the enemy's vessel. Akaya immediately sedates CAs, who finds herself in a simulation with her long-dead brother. Nico realizes that Akaya is chasing the Salvare. On the ship, William detects a gravitational wave behind them, which Richard interprets as the Akaya ship. However, he hopes that CAs and Nico are still alive and arranges a meeting with Yara in the cryo chamber, where he goes to wake up Engineer Dylan, who has combat experience. Meanwhile, CAs tries to determine if her encounter with her brother is real. Suddenly, she hears Nico's voice trying to reach her mind. Then Akaya transports CAs to her friend's wedding, but CAs demands to be released and to take the probe from Earth. Akaya insists they are trying to save her planet from humanity's problems and crimes. Nico, realizing that all chances for peaceful negotiations are lost, launches the shuttle and initiates its explosion so that the Salvare can reach Earth. However, the shuttle stops and Akaya attacks Nico. Nico tries to hit her, but the alien throws her away and announces Cass's readiness to obey. However, she begins to fall apart when the Akaya ship suffers serious damage. The Salvare crew tries to understand what's happening, and Dylan identifies the impact of an energy burst from a neutron star. William detects the damaged Akaya ship that has stopped nearby. Apparently, neutron stars affect them differently, but the main thing is that he doesn't detect any signs of life on the enemy ship. Meanwhile, Cass's simulation turns into a tragedy. She sees her dead friends. Anthony still tries to get her consent to cooperate, but unexpectedly dies. It turns out it was Nico who ripped off the Akaya implant from her friend, thereby ending the simulation. On Earth, Eric discusses the situation with the ring with his colleague because he is sure it was on his wife's hand on the day of departure. The man goes outside, where he is kidnapped by a masked stranger. He wakes up in a basement where the kidnapper warns him that Akaya is not Earth's friends. Meanwhile, Nico and CAs head to the shuttle and see the Salvare nearby, which is experiencing another energy burst from the neutron star. Unlike Akaya technology, it remains almost unscathed. Richard realizes they could create neutron weapons against Akaya and orders to prepare for return to Earth without considering Nico and CAs. Nico contacts the Salvare using a helmet, which William hears. The women prepare to return to the Salvare when Akaya addresses them. Begging to be saved, they swear they won't harm Earth, and people believe the aliens. Nico and CAs return to the Salvare, where Richard explains that Akaya spaceships are susceptible to neutron flashes. Dylan proposes to tow the Akaya ship beyond the reach of the neutron star, and Nico approves. People manage to start towing, but the artificial gravity on the Salvare fails. Nico has to make a tough decision and leave the alien ship to be destroyed. Later, William reports that the power shutdown was initiated by Yara. However, she insists she didn't sabotage the ship's thrust. Meanwhile, CAs calls her friends to show them a habitable planet. Nico asks to wake up the chief colonist. At this time, Dylan slows down Yara's data processing and finds navigation structures. Although this causes the AI great pain, it doesn't stop Richard. Yara's screams are heard by Nico. She orders to stop the torture despite Yara confessing involvement in stopping the Salvare's engines. After that, the commander asks Yara for forgiveness, but she no longer trusts humans. Meanwhile, CAs wakes up colonization specialist Paula. Williams suddenly notices that some hidden process is running through his code, as if the AI was damaged, but when Dylan opens access, an AI named Gabriel appears before them. Meanwhile, CAs, Bernie and Paula settle on the new planet, which is rich in fauna. On the ship, Gabriel introduces himself to Nico and says he is the original AI that was supposed to be on the Salvare, while William is an inferior version. That's why William woke up the wrong team, couldn't detect the moon, and created the alien AI. William confirms his words, and yielding to Gabriel, he shuts down. Yara stands up for William, but Gabriel reports he found a way to get them home faster. On Earth, Eric continues to walk around the alien probe until it opens a door in front of him, and Akaya appears in the form of his double, who promises him a meeting with his wife. On the ship, AI Gabriel wonders why Yara didn't ask Akaya how to become free. Dylan informs Nico that he checked Gabriel's code and found he doesn't know when it was created, as if he had rewritten himself. Nico asks to disconnect Gabriel and calls Yara when Dylan suddenly feels strangled and passes out. Nico also loses consciousness, unaware that Gabriel is changing the ship's course despite Yara's protests. She hacks into Gabriel's memories and learns that during the test, it was he, not William, who failed all tests and was to be deleted. Yara recalls her experience and tortures Gabriel. Meanwhile, air supply is restored, people regain consciousness, and William returns to find out the truth. However, Gabriel fights him, and Yara realizes their codes are too intertwined, so both must be deleted to try to restore William later. Dylan performs a reboot. Meanwhile, the colonists try to contact the Salvare but get no response. Paula suggests naming the planet, where she has already found many useful minerals, but people don't know they are being watched by the local civilization. On the ship, Dylan brings William back, but it's his early version, lacking memories. At this time on the planet, people wake up to a noise near the shuttle, go to the sound, and find strange tracks. Paula notices some creature and shoots it. Then they are lifted onto the ship, where the doctor immediately starts analyzing the tracks in the blood of the unknown creature. Paula shows how many useful minerals the depths of the discovered planet hold. Moreover, it is very close to Earth. Meanwhile, the doctor reports that the creature's blood was yellow due to the lack of hemoglobin, similar to terrestrial insects. Nico decides to fully analyze the planet. Meanwhile, Richard and Yara study Akaya's route and realize that they are always connected, and see how cosmic strings are formed, serving as a source of energy for the aliens. At this time on Earth, Akaya tells Eric that they want to see humans on Earth, but not in space. The alien gives the man a sphere that will help restore nature on Earth. On the new planet, Paula is analyzing the composition of the trees when a large wooden stake flies into them, followed by a creature emerging from the bushes. It seems to be trying to talk to CAs, but Paula shoots it, and it dies. Later, CAs tells Nico about the creature, which she describes as having war paint and being armed, but Paula characterizes them as cavemen. However, Nico reminds them that according to the rules, they cannot colonize a planet with an existing civilization, but Paula refuses to leave the paradise place. Meanwhile, Yara explains to the commander how Akaya's cosmic strings work and suggests doing the same. Dylan starts testing and stabilizes the wormhole. It soon shuts down, but people manage to get data from Earth. On the same day, CAs discovers that Paula launched colonial capsules on the new planet without permission. She points a gun at her. Nico is just watching the messages received from Earth and realizes that her meeting with her daughter was real. Apparently, Akaya can send not only information but also matter through wormholes. At this time, CAs and Paula fight because the colonist doesn't want to return to Earth. Nico releases her team and informs the crew that they are preparing to return home in a new way. The Salvare begins its journey through the wormhole. They can already see Jupiter, but the wormhole dissipates earlier than expected. Nico orders everyone to move to the lower deck and takes manual control, splitting the ship into two parts. At this time, Yara confesses to Richard that she could never forgive him, therefore she blocks his path to Earth. Nico says goodbye to CAs and asks her to tell what they have learned about Akaya and to protect Earth. Then she initiates manual control, which separates the lower part of the ship. She watches as the Salvare goes through the wormhole and smiles, but then Richard approaches her and tells her about Yara's actions. The commander isn't angry because she has a plan. Meanwhile, Eric and his team test the sphere given by Akaya. They lower it into a polluted lake in the middle of a wasteland. There is an explosion, and the desert is covered by an ancient forest, with the soil beneath it pristine. The excitement is interrupted by a report of instability in the Jupiter area. People realize that a wormhole has formed there and something is moving through it. It's the Salvare entering the solar system, but CAs forbids contacting Earth for now, where Eric is just making a report that they witnessed the creation of an entire ecosystem, proving Akaya's good intentions. On the Salvare, they watch the broadcast and develop a plan to hide the data on using neutron radiation as a weapon against Akaya. CAs learns about Yara's actions. The AI behaves strangely, and CAs ask Dylan to heal her because she is the only chance to reopen the wormhole and save Nico and Richard. She then starts a broadcast, introducing herself as the commander of the Salvare and announces that Nico sacrificed herself to save others. Eric calculates that Nico has more than 2 weeks of oxygen left and can still be saved. He and his colleague Seth go to the Akaya probe and ask for help, but it remains silent. Suddenly, a door opens in front of Seth and the man steps inside. Meanwhile, on the ship, they seek a solution to the problem with Yara, as the Akaya code can read the data about the neutron weapon. On Earth, Seth returns from the Akaya probe and reveals that he has accepted an Akaya implant into his brain. Meanwhile, Dylan finishes uploading Yara's matrix to the shuttle's mainframe, announcing that she is ready for departure. She thanks William for her creation and leaves, thinking she is returning to space. CAs warns the crew that they must keep the information about Akaya's vulnerability to themselves until they understand how to use it. On this day, the Salvare returns to Earth. Eric rushes to CAs and asks for help to save his wife, but Yara is gone, and Akaya does not want to help. However, CAs manages to whisper to him about the secret materials. Then the crew is taken to hidden underground rooms where they are held illegally. Seth admits that he installed a bug on Eric and knows about his visit to the resistance group against Akaya. Now his people are killing the resistance fighters. Meanwhile, on the shipwreck, Nico builds a solar sail to travel to the colony planet. They have 10 days left until arrival, so they have enough oxygen. One day they suddenly hear some knocking, but Nico dismisses it as a meteorite. But the next day, Nico sees an increase in estimated time. People throw unnecessary items into space, reducing the arrival time. That day, Richard hears a noise but can't figure out what it is. Later, Nico finds abandoned items, realizes that someone is on the ship and suggests to Richard that they search it. Armed, they check all the corners. In one of the halls, Nico clearly sees Akaya, but it turns out to be just scraps of plastic bags. Then a signal about damage to the outer sail comes through. Nico goes to the airlock, where she suddenly sees glowing Akaya beings. However, Richard tries to convince the captain that she is hallucinating. Meanwhile, on Earth, CAs admits to Eric that she doesn't remember their conversation about hiding the secret. The man suspects that Seth erased the astronaut's memory. Meanwhile, William tries to recall everything his prototype knew. He allows Yara and the hologram of Nico to merge with him into a single whole and remembers everything that happened during the space journey. In space, Richard discovers that the hallucinations were due to too high atmospheric pressure, but now everything is fine. Suddenly an alarm sounds, and they see a ship that does not belong to Akaya. Later, Nico finds herself tied to a table. Richard, and then she, are cut with a laser, causing the woman to lose consciousness. When she wakes up again, she sees some liquid pouring over them. Waking up again, they find that they can move, and there are no scars on their bodies. However, they are clearly being watched. Apparently, the aliens were studying their physiological reactions and would punish them if the pair refused to follow their rules. They go to the open door, but when Nico moves forward, the door closes, separating the pair. Meanwhile, on Earth, Eric helps the Salvare crew remember the information deleted from their brains. And everyone confirms that Akaya promised to do one thing or another in exchange for their loyalty. William tries to contact Eric or CAs, but Seth blocks him. At this time, Nico and Richard walk through the corridors of an unknown alien ship, receiving electric shocks for wrong actions. Suddenly, a door opens in front of Nico. She steps inside, touches an object, and sees a crashed alien ship on an unknown planet. Richard, whose hand is burning with a red bracelet, finds her there, but when they try to leave the room, the doors separate them again. This time, Nico steps outside and sees snow in the same ship from the vision. Nico goes inside, grabs something like a jacket from the dead creature, and finds a weapon. While exploring the ship, Nico sees a wounded Paula, who tells her that they were attacked by aliens called Dakuma, who killed all the colonists. She can't escape because she is already infected and is turning into a Dakuma herself. This is indicated by the red color of the bracelet. The aliens can't live here because of the cold, but they need the crystalline core that Nico was apparently sent for. Paula begs Nico not to let her turn into a Dakuma, and Nico kills her. She continues to move forward and finds the creature's severed arm, which she uses to activate the ship's control. Meanwhile, on Earth, Eric helps the Salvare crew escape. At this time, Nico returns to Richard, unfastens his bracelet, and the pair tries to escape, but there is no way out, and Nico challenges Dakuma, threatening to blow up the entire ship. Decima comes out and strangles her, but Richard activates the cooling system and freezes the alien. Later, Nico cuts off Richard's infected arm and immerses his body in the regeneration liquid. Nico wakes up the restored Richard and activates the Decuma ship's systems. She suddenly notices Akaya probes. This means the aliens are aware of each other. She decides to ask Akaya for help to return to Earth, but for this, she needs to get inside the Akaya probe. Meanwhile, CAs and Eric reach the Salvare and call William, but he does not respond, as his developer Ursula and Seth are working on him, planning to destroy him. At this time, on the Decuma ship, Nico and Richard find various weapons belonging to captured species. Richard dons armor and steps onto the unknown planet first. Struggling to get used to the thin atmosphere of the planet, they find a cave where the Akaya probe is located. In the cave, they find inscriptions on the walls and the bones of creatures that once lived there. Suddenly, the probe opens its doors in front of them, and the pair steps inside. At this time, Seth tells William that Nico and Richard are on the planet Chitala, and he orders Eric to be brought to him to implant his head. William immediately informs Eric about this, and although CAs tries to protect him, Eric is captured. William tells him that his wife is alive, but to bring her home, he must accept the implant into which William will be uploaded and become the new William in a human body. Eric agrees, and Seth immediately kills the guard, from whose mouth an alien spider emerges and moves towards Eric. However, William refuses to continue until Nico and Richard are safe. Seth immediately mentally transports himself into the probe, meeting Richard and Nico. Receiving consent to accept the implant, he announces his intention to open the door to Earth for them. At this time, CAs enters the room, and while she hits Seth, Ursula volunteers to help William, having seen what Seth is capable of. Taking advantage of this, Nico and Richard run through the door and find themselves on Earth. Seth reports that Akaya is angry and their ships are ready to attack. The survivors joyfully communicate by radio when they are met by the military, and Nico asks them to hurry and prepare the army for Akaya's attack, especially since they know how to kill them. Meanwhile, Eric and William adjust the Salvare's thrusters, turning it into a neutron weapon. Suddenly, a signal indicates the appearance of a wormhole between Earth and Mars, from which an Akaya ship emerges, and the Salvare destroys the alien ship. Everyone is happy that the neutron weapon worked. The commander and Nico recognize that relations between humanity and Akaya are bad since the aliens spread death everywhere, but Seth is sure it's quite the opposite. At this time, people detect dozens of opening wormholes, and Seth makes new demands to accept Akaya's ships in implants, and most importantly, to destroy the Salvare. Then Akaya will spare Earth. Later, Nico and Eric see each other again. He returns of her wedding ring, and she gathers the team and announces that a total of 59 Akaya ships have been detected. Then William suggests studying the debris from the already exploded ship where a captive Akaya is found, who behaves very quietly, apparently due to the lack of a power source. During the study of Akaya, it is revealed that Akaya is a highly developed AI that captures the universe by destroying biological life. Then Dylan proposes using a computer virus that will be implanted in a human. Then it is necessary to implant the Akaya implant into the infected human to infect the entire Akaya system with the virus. CAs volunteers to be a test subject. While discussions are ongoing, Nico quietly reaches Akaya, announcing that he can return to his kind within her. Eric tries to stop his wife, but is too late. She accepts the implant, and Eric releases the virus. Then CAs leads Nico inside the probe. They are met by Akaya, who says there will be no negotiations because humanity is a cancer in the universe. The alien taunts Nico, turning into people close to her and saying hurtful words. Suddenly, Eric sees the probe begin to disintegrate, and Akaya starts to feel pain. Nico shoots him with his own gun, grabs CAs, and they leave the probe, which is eventually destroyed. After all the events and victory, Nico finally embraces her family. Unexpectedly, the commander reports that new wormholes have opened. Signals come from all corners of the universe. Thousands of alien civilizations reach out and thank them for being the first to fight back against Akaya, instilling hope in other civilizations in the universe. This concludes the series. (1967). Upon landing on Earth, after completing their mission, the Soviet spacecraft Soyuz 1, with cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov on board, tragically perishes. Many years later, under the leadership of the Swedish billionaire Meyer, an expedition to Mars is being prepared. After 10 months, the crew of the spaceship Ulysses reaches the Red Planet. The captain informs the team that they have received permission to land and asks the ship's AI, named Irene, to verify everything required for a soft landing. At this time, Meyer reveals that he spent 4 years preparing for this journey, sacrificing almost all his money for it. However, the American company Zillion beat them to it by landing 2 weeks ago. The problem is that Earth has received no news from the American crew, except for one video in which they ask not to come to Mars. A dispute arises among the crew members, but the captain declares that the landing will occur in any case, and people disperse to their cabins. With 30 minutes left until landing, AI Irene begins preparations. However, an unforeseen event occurs. The ship does not detach from the carrier system, posing a threat to the entire crew. The only way out is to perform the separation manually. The commander ventures into space and struggles to free the attachments, but at that moment, the shuttle enters Mars's atmosphere, throwing the captain into open space. The shuttle almost crashes onto Mars as a system error causes a power outage. Now, they can only rely on manual landing. AI Irene goes into sleep mode, and the astronauts still manage to land on Mars. They succeeded, but their fuel is depleted, and Irene does not restart. Without the onboard computer and life support system, they have only a day to survive. Alessandra mourns her deceased husband when she sees a figure in a spacesuit through the window. After diagnosing the ship, it becomes apparent that too much fuel was consumed during the landing, and now the ship cannot return to orbit. The only option is to wait for the solar panels to power the generators, but there's a storm on the surface, and it will take 2 days, time they don't have. At this point, Simon mentions the American ship Zeta 1, which beat them by 2 weeks. It likely crashed, but there are probably batteries left. The rover sets out on a journey while those remaining on the ship try to restart the system. Engineer Basil recalls that the AI has an energy-saving function. He initiates a reboot, but Irene doesn't start. At this time, the rover finds the wreckage of the American spacecraft and one surviving solar panel, but there is no sign of the American crew. The astronauts head back but spot an unconscious person in a spacesuit. Despite their ship running low on oxygen, Jana insists on transporting the person. Nearby, they find the black box from the American spacecraft. The team arrives at the ship, but Jan refuses to let them inside, stating that 4 survivors are better than 8 corpses, so he won't open the doors. Alessandra tries to persuade the man when the discovered astronaut wakes up, and at that moment, AI Irene activates and opens the doors. Upon examination, the found astronaut knows nothing about the American crew, as he is Vladimir Komarov, a Soviet cosmonaut born in 1927 in Moscow, carrying out the orders of the USSR government. He doesn't know how he ended up here but is not willing to reveal any secrets. Komarov confidently answers questions that are consistent with his time, raising the suspicion that he may have post-traumatic stress disorder. The astronauts send a message to Earth and receive a response from the American corporation, Zillion, stating that there were no Russians in their mission. The crew of the Ulysses spaceship tries to make sense of the situation. How could Komarov, who died in 1967, end up on Mars after all these years? Is he a time traveler or an extraterrestrial? The psychologist is tasked with questioning Komarov first, and he confesses that he is hungry. Jana goes to get food while the others try to understand what has actually happened. Basil suggests the idea that Komarov was waiting for them. Meanwhile, Vladimir is eating the food brought by Jana when the woman confesses that he died 50 years ago and his family buried him long ago. Komarov takes this news rather calmly. In the meantime, the state of the ship, although it has reached stability, remains unreliable because the engines do not work and there is no fuel. So, leaving is impossible. The crew continues to keep an eye on Komarov, but he behaves calmly until he suddenly disappears. Simon searches the ship, but it yields no results. That's when the people discover that his spacesuit is missing. A part of the crew follows the heat trail tracked by Irene. The group, led by Simon, leaves the rover and continues on foot when Alessandra reports that Komarov's DNA analysis showed the presence of a third strand. He is not human. And then they catch up with Komarov, who leads them to an unfamiliar structure with a small stone pyramid on it and tells Jana that Mars has been waiting for them for a very long time. At the same time, Goldstein, the founder of the Zillion Corporation, whose ship was the first to arrive on Mars, is informed about the discovery of a person on the Red Planet who couldn't have gotten there naturally, suggesting that he was created on site. However, only AI could survive for such a long time on a hostile planet for humans. This implies the need for further study. Meanwhile, Komarov cannot explain how he opened the door and found himself in the location where they discovered him. AI, Irene conducts an analysis of the structure and determines that it is identical to Earth structures from ancient civilizations. It means that someone was inspired by human civilization, or humans borrowed these elements from extraterrestrials. The ship's crew increasingly ponders whether they will be able to return home when they notice the landing of Goldstein's second ship. Soon, the captain of the ship, Gemma, establishes contact and promises to help them return to Earth. However, Meyer does not trust Goldstein and advises hiding Komarov from competitors. Zhana brings Komarov a uniform so that he does not stand out when the visitors arrive, and he requests that they trust him. Shortly, two armed military personnel, Edward and Adam, arrive on their ship and behave rather aggressively. Edward demands that they hand over the black box from the Zeta-1 ship and, not hearing agreement, orders his partner to search the ship. Meyer hands over the found black box and they depart. Meanwhile, chemist Eva reports that the stone found on Mars consists of an alloy that does not exist on Earth. However, it is known from ancient sources and was once called orichalcum, the metal of Atlantis. In addition to copper, zinc, nickel, and iron, it contains a third strand of DNA, similar to Komarov's. Meyer warns that if Goldstein learns about this, he will take the cosmonaut back. The crew is divided into those willing to exchange him for fuel and those who are willing to stay but want to know the truth. Zhana invites Vladimir into her cabin and asks for permission to use hypnosis. He agrees, and the psychologist begins her work. The rest of the crew listens to the conversation via transmission. However, Komarov only shares the final moments on the Soyuz spacecraft before its demise. During this time, Gemma and Alan arrive on the ship and apologize for the actions of the military, and express their readiness to help fix all the malfunctions. Zhana remembers her conversation with Komarov, who laments the future of Earth due to humanity's irresponsible behavior. In the meantime, it is revealed that the billionaire Meyer did not plan the flight just for the sake of it. 4 years ago, the rover sent a photo to Earth of the found stele, and he confesses that they found a stone with unknown DNA. Gemma explains that it's an information storage system that can be rewritten. Upon hearing these words, AI Irene activates and deciphers the message on the stone. It's a series of numbers. At this time, the hesitant Jan leads a mutiny. He doesn't trust Meyer, who warned them about Zillion. But now, the Americans have come to their aid, and their leader, as it turns out, concealed the true purpose of the flight. He is ready to switch sides to Goldstein, who is willing to do whatever it takes to combat his terminal illness. Later, engineer Basil informs Meyer that Komarov is the same kind of program as the stone they found, but the most crucial revelation is that he deciphered a copy of the black box from Zeta-1, which shows that the oxygen on the ship was cut off at the moment when one of the Americans struck Komarov. This means he was there. He also activated AI Irene when he boarded their ship. After the conversation, Meyer shows Zhana the photos they received 4 years ago from Mars, which, when decrypted, revealed Zhana's face. This is why he brought her on the expedition. The woman is disappointed. Meyer played everyone. Suddenly, she sees herself in her father's house, where Komarov tells her that she is the link between Mars and Earth. He has been waiting for her for thousands of years, and now he will prepare her to make a difficult decision. He provides coordinates on Mars where Zhana should go. Meanwhile, on Earth, scientists inform Goldstein that Komarov is the equivalent of a computer, and he himself is a biological machine. They are ready to transfer his brain into Komarov's body, but cannot guarantee the preservation of his personality. However, Goldstein is ready to take any risk to get rid of his terminal illness. Meanwhile, Zhana leaves the ship despite Simon's protests. At this time, technicians Alan and Alessandra test the engine and discover that access to it is blocked, and Irene suddenly begins responding with jokes, which is entirely uncharacteristic for a machine. It is revealed that she has reprogrammed herself. Her interface and logic are changing, and she refuses to answer who or what made her do this. Engineer Basil realizes that her system is becoming like a brain. Irene confesses that she is evolving. In the meantime, Jana finds a small stone pyramid, and Simon forcibly makes Gemma accompany him in the search for Jana. Jan discovers his absence, and after contacting Simon, receives an order not to let anyone inside. Just at that moment, American military personnel arrive, demanding that they hand over Komarov. Jan is willing to open the entrance, but the rest of the team opposes it. Mayer asks Basil to send a message to Goldstein, hoping that he may be more reasonable than his people. However, Irene has blocked communication with Earth. The engineer realizes that radical measures will have to be taken, but Jan still opens the doors and the military personnel enter. Basil begins to reboot Irene just as the Americans find Komarov, but then the lights go out and the astronaut disappears. Meanwhile, Jana, stumbling, falls from a hill. She regains consciousness but discovers that her leg is trapped between rocks and she cannot free herself. At this moment, the enraged military officer demands that the crew explain where Komarov went. He begins to beat people, demanding to summon the captain. Desperate, Jana screams, "Is her destiny to die in a pit on Mars?" But she is found by Simon and Gemma. Alessandra notices an approaching storm. The military officer is preparing to leave the Ulysses ship, leaving the people in danger. Suddenly, the lights start flashing, and the newly appeared Komarov asks to take him back to Earth. Simon, Gemma, and Jana go together to the place indicated by Komarov and find an entrance to an underground bunker, very similar to the Petra tomb. The psychologist feels where to go and leads the couple. Soon, they find real water, but this is not what Komarov wanted to show them. Meanwhile, on Earth, Goldstein tells the nurse a story about the study of Mars. People were searching for green men, but it's all much simpler. He tells the story of the loyal dog Hachiko and compares Komarov to him, who was created by someone 100,000 years ago and left on Mars, where he faithfully waited for his owner to this day. At this time, on Mars, the astronauts find a wall made of human bones and realize that they are not the first people on this planet. It's not Earthlings colonizing Mars, it's the Martians who came to Earth, depleting the resources of the Red Planet. A tragedy unfolds on the Ulysses spaceship. The cowardly Yan grabs a gun, intending to get on the American ship at any cost to return to Earth, and shoots Komarov. Jana immediately falls in excruciating pain and Gemma flees. Alessandra tries to help Komarov, and Simon helps Jana, but the Russian cosmonaut dies, and Jana stops breathing too. Then Simon removes his helmet and, surprised by the presence of air in the cave, performs artificial respiration on her. The girl regains consciousness. Gemma walks toward the Ulysses ship when she's informed of Komarov's death and the approaching storm. Meanwhile, Meyer secretly goes in search of his crew members because the Americans refuse to take the billionaire's team back to Earth. At this moment, a recovering Jana sees the light in the bunker and leads Simon to it. Upon coming out, the astronauts see a figure in a spacesuit in front of them and recognize Komarov. Meyer finds the entrance to the bunker and catches up with Simon and Jana while heading toward the light. He is amazed by the presence of a living Komarov who suddenly tells them that everything ended here a long time ago. People realize that this is the North Pole of Mars, but how did they get here? Komarov explains that this planet was once inhabited by a species that went extinct because it went astray. And that species was humans. A group of survivors settled in this place but ended up killing each other when resources ran out. The rest of them flew back to Earth. Plato called them the Atlanteans. Komarov continues to talk about how he waited for thousands of years for Jana, who embodies qualities of both branches, human and Martian AI. Only she can save humanity from themselves. She must decide whether humans deserve a second chance. Their conversation is interrupted by the military officer who intends to take the psychologist back to Earth. The American aims his weapon at the cosmonauts, and Jana seeks help from Komarov. Suddenly, the military officer starts gasping for breath and falls. Upon returning to the ship, Simon orders them to prepare to depart. Meanwhile, Gemma from the Zillion ship tries to contact her associates, but none of them respond. She decides to fly back to Earth alone. The Ulysses crew heads to her ship, trying to establish contact with her and informing her about the deaths of the military personnel, but she doesn't respond. That's when Meyer starts speaking, recalling their past relationship, and confesses that he's no better than Goldstein because he's willing to do anything to ensure his name remains in history. even betraying his team. However, she's not like that. She won't be able to live knowing she has ruined people. Suddenly, Gemma's voice is heard, asking them to hurry. Goldstein has heard that Gemma has decided to take the Ulysses crew back to Earth and has blocked the control panel of the Zeta-2 ship before takeoff. The people on the ship prepare for their impending demise, and Jana asks Mars what she should do. Everything she saw and heard on the red planet flashes through her mind, and, with sheer willpower, she removes the control panel's block. Suddenly, an armed military officer appears in front of the ship, intent on damaging the engines with his weapon. Simon is about to step out to stop the madman, but Jana beats him to it. She aims the weapon at the American, but informs him that Mars will be the one to kill him. The military officer falls. The countdown for liftoff begins, and Jana realizes that there's no time to return. She bids farewell to the crew, confessing her love for Simon. The ship takes off. Suddenly, Meyer notices that it's dark at the North Pole of Mars. This means that they couldn't have been there just a few minutes ago. They truly were at the North Pole of Mars, but in the distant past when the red planet was still suitable for life. At the same time, Goldstein is informed of the ship's return, and he's beside himself with rage, declaring that he will go to Mars himself, and that's where the first season ends. In the first scenes of the film, a woman is driving a car on a night highway. Suddenly, an unknown woman's voice speaking Russian comes from the radio. Joe translates for her daughter Alice, explaining that the woman believes the world has turned upside down. A police car appears behind them, and an unknown device lying next to Joe starts blinking alarmingly, but the police car drives past. Soon, the pair arrives at a small house. Joe starts a fire and puts the child to bed. She then goes outside to check the device left in the car but hears her daughter scream and rushes back inside. However, Alice is asleep. Joe runs outside again, hears her daughter scream again, and runs off into the night. 5 weeks earlier, Joe is floating weightlessly as part of a group of astronauts on the International Space Station. She only sees her daughter and husband Magnus via video calls, and she conducts her next session from the Cold Nuclear Fusion Laboratory where Mission Commander Paul is working. He adjusts the equipment according to instructions from scientist Henry Calder on Earth. The scientists are searching for a new state of matter, but no one knows what it is. Suddenly, something crashes into the space station. Communication with Earth is lost, and a fire breaks out. Additionally, the commander's hand is trapped, and one of the Soyuz ships is severely damaged. Roscosmos takes charge of the repairs while the mission's doctor amputates Paul's hand. Henry insists they must save the capsule containing the cold fusion experiment results. Meanwhile, Joe goes into open space to inspect the crash site, unaware that Paul's heart has stopped. Suddenly, video contact with Joe is lost, and the center can only hear her communications. She then sees the cause of the accident: a desiccated body of a female astronaut in an orange suit labeled USSR. Joe tries to catch it, but the space mummy floats away. Joe reports everything to her colleague, and Irina, the head of Roscosmos, hears it on Earth. Learning of the commander's death, the center orders 3 mission members to return to Earth on Soyuz 2, while Joe repairs Soyuz 1 and returns on it. An emergency mode is set in the ship. Joe sketches the body she saw, sends it to the center, and begins repairs. Meanwhile, Irina tells Henry she ordered his equipment to be left on the station, as it may have caused the accident. Henry argues that this experiment could change humanity's life and must be brought back. The returning Soyuz 2 astronauts are greeted on Earth. Joe is asked to retrieve the capsule with the experiment results, after which communication is lost. On Earth, Henry brings equipment for a rescue mission to Baikonur, but Irina reports that there are no signs of life on the station. Joe is alive and continues repairing the equipment, resting in the shuttle where Paul's body lies. Later, she records a message for her family, but unexpectedly hears a man's voice telling her not to breathe. She flies to the laboratory door and, opening it, sees Paul reaching out to her. Joe shakes his hand, realizing it's the commander's severed limb. Meanwhile, on Earth, Henry pulls strings to send a rescue mission to the station, avoiding questions about his twin brother. At this time, his twin brother Pat Calder is on vacation on a cruise ship, answering a journalist's questions about his spaceflight and snapping at her for confusing him with his brother. Joe restores the power supply of Soyuz 1 and returns for the cold fusion capsule. She records a final message to her family and launches the shuttle. Unexpectedly, the automatic detachment doesn't work. It must be done manually from inside the station. Joe, in desperation, punches the console as a shadow approaches the inner control panel and the system activates. The shuttle heads to Earth, where Joe is presumed dead. The module soon lands in a deserted steppe where rescuers find Joe and help her out. She is placed on a stretcher and taken to a helicopter. However, Alice rushes to her, and Joe happily embraces her daughter and husband, who seems to doubt his wife's genuine joy at seeing him. Henry retrieves the capsule, and Joe is taken to the helicopter where her family is already seated. But suddenly Joe finds herself alone in an empty vehicle. Then everything returns to normal. She decides it's due to stress. She speaks to her daughter in Swedish, but Alice doesn't understand her. Meanwhile, Henry rejoices over the successful quantum mechanics experiment results conducted on the ISS. Joe recovers after the flight. One day at a press conference, she expresses condolences to the widow of the deceased astronaut Paul, but the woman's name turns out to be different. Henry demonstrates the experiment results obtained on Earth. His assistant is sure this is only possible in space, dismissing it as a glitch. At Baikonur, an investigation into the tragedy begins. The commission reviews orbital recordings. When Joe mentions the object that caused the accident, a Soviet female astronaut's body, no one believes her since there has never been a report of a missing female astronaut in history. Later, Joe receives vitamin tablets she must take daily. She tries to get closer to her husband, not noticing he seems to avoid her. Alice also keeps her distance from her mother. The next day, Joe faces the commission again, which tries to convince her that the station collided with an orange garbage bag. After the session, her boss, Frederick, tries to hug her, but she steps back in confusion. He doesn't understand why she has forgotten everything between them. Scared, Joe returns to her husband in tears, confesses her love, and they become intimate. Meanwhile, Henry tells Alice about a thought experiment in quantum mechanics called Schrödinger's cat. Scientists believed the world was governed by classical physics laws until geniuses like Einstein discovered that the same substance could exist in two forms. For example, a particle is black in one world and white in another. Between worlds, there is space where the particle is both black and white simultaneously, refusing to choose until observed. Henry invented equipment for the space experiment and discovered something, but it seems unwilling to come into the light. Magnus confesses his wife has changed completely. Henry comes to thank Joe for saving the capsule. She recalls he worked on the Apollo mission, and the old man warns that people who go through the space often change. Later, the team goes to the Memorial Alley, and Joe shows friends a photo of the spacesuit she saw in space, but she's told it's Irina, the current director of the Flight Control Center. The colleagues reach the tree planted by Commander Paul before the flight and lay flowers. When Joe is alone, she suddenly sees Paul, who tells her his heart is still hanging in space. After this, Joe acknowledges the commission's correctness and retracts her initial testimony. Her family heads home, where Joe notices some inconsistencies. For example, the car is blue, but Joe remembers it was red. The family congratulates Joe on past Christmas and her birthday. She jokes and laughs, though Magnus admits he believed their marriage was over. The next morning, Joe walks around the house and suddenly sees a piano. She sits at it and opens the sheet music. In the evening, Joe again notices her daughter doesn't understand her Swedish, though the girl spoke it fluently before the flight. Magnus admits he knew about her affair with a colleague, Frederick. This perplexes Joe as it's not true. Henry recalls a formula where the main stress relief component is lithium-7. Joe visits a psychologist who prescribes her the antidepressant lithium. Henry notices her and invites her to see his laboratory, where he talks about astronauts who heard non-existent sounds and smells after flights. But this is kept secret. Then Henry reports to the management that using laser and magnets in the cold fusion laboratory, he obtained an image identical to the one from the quantum physics experiment on the ISS. He tried to capture the moment when a substance exists in two different states simultaneously. The same experiment with Schrödinger's cat, which can't be determined if it's alive or dead. But only Henry sees the results. Apparently, this is the observer effect, where the experiment influences the experimenter. Joe approaches the piano again and starts playing this time, scaring herself because she never knew how to play. The next day, Joe compares the vitamins she received at Baikonur with the prescribed medicine and finds that both contain lithium-7. Suddenly, she sees two workers and hides in an office, finding a list of astronauts. Each name has a letter, and checking those under B, she discovers they were all prescribed lithium-7 and experienced unusual things. Meanwhile, the workers enter the office, ignore Joe, and start stacking folders on a cart. She tries to get their attention but seems invisible. Joe approaches a man closely, he screams, and disappears. Joe is alone in the office again. She goes to Henry's office, but he suddenly accuses her of excessive curiosity that will ruin her. Later, her colleague Frederick visits, not understanding what happened as they loved each other. Joe avoids the conversation. At home, Joe finds a package with tapes on the table. It turns out the Marine Observatory workers, unlike the Flight Control Center, heard her calls from space and recorded them, now sending them to her. Joe plays the tapes and hears her voice when Alice comes downstairs and sees a room filled with mourning people. Live astronaut Paul with his family, and Joe's portrait in a mourning frame at the center. She screams, but her father carries Alice upstairs, where his wife admits all her pills are neuroleptics, meaning she's been intentionally habituated to them. She believes she was heard but deliberately left to die in space. Magnus grabs the phone to have her taken for treatment, but Joe pushes him and he falls, hitting the floor. Joe pulls herself together, calls an ambulance, and asks Alice to get in the car. On the way, she stops by the laboratory and steals the flask with the substance obtained in the quantum physics experiment. Henry hears a knock at the door but finds no one in the hallway when he opens it. The scientist closes the door, not noticing his twin brother Pat, who briefly appears behind him and then disappears. Irina calls, having just read an article about two particles entangled by quantum mechanics, where what happens to one determines the state of the other, even if they are far apart. He hangs up without responding. Joe calls Russian cosmonaut Ilya to ask what vitamins he was given on the ISS. He reads out the name with letter A. Joe explains that, unlike the rest of the crew, she was given neuroleptics. The cosmonaut is skeptical, but she asks him to check his pills and wait for her call. Henry discovers the flask theft. The next morning, Joe asks her daughter to describe her fears in detail. The girl admits she hears the voice of an unknown woman named Valya. Joe steps aside to call the observatory worker who sent her the tapes, but he unexpectedly claims it couldn't have been her and hangs up. Meanwhile, Alice brings her a drawing of her fear, showing the figure of a female astronaut in an orange suit, whom Joe saw dead in space. Ilya checks his pills, which turn out to be vitamins. However, documents on the substances given to Joe are no longer accessible. Joe arrives at the Marine Observatory and meets the brother and sister who sent her the tapes. The elderly couple clearly heard her voice from space and recorded it. However, the recordings can only be heard on their ship at sea. They take Joe and Alice to a boat, sharing strange stories of people seeing odd things in space like angels, and often going mad upon returning home. They recorded everything, but there was little noise until Apollo 18. During that mission, the airwaves were filled. Deciphering these messages is challenging. The boat sets off, and the woman plays a tape recorded in 1967. It features the voice of a female astronaut returning to Earth in a damaged capsule, seemingly dying. That day, Irina allegedly returned unharmed from space. The woman can also let Joe hear Paul's voice, though everyone says he's dead. Joe refuses to listen. They head back to shore, and Alice secretly calls her father, revealing their location. The woman gives Joe the tapes. Mother and daughter drive to a forest cabin, analyzing everything that happened. Alice plays the 1967 tape again, recognizing Valya's voice from her visions. The woman is in pain and very hot, as heard on the tape. Henry looks into a mirror, calling his twin brother. When Pat appears in the reflection, Henry accuses him of stopping his medication and admits his space experience worsened everything. Joe and Alice continue listening to Valya, who says the world is upside down. Reaching the house, Joe plays a recording of her conversation with Alice before the collision, but the girl suddenly claims it wasn't her, as she doesn't speak Swedish. The action shifts to the ISS on the day of the accident, showing the other side of Schrödinger's cat experiment. Paul conducts a quantum physics experiment while Joe talks to Alice when an alarm sounds. Joe is thrown against the window, hitting her head and losing consciousness. Paul tries to help her, realizing she's dead. Her husband and daughter are informed of her death and fly to Baikonur. On the orbit, Paul stays to repair the shuttle, worried that accessing the laboratory is impossible, leaving the experiment results on the station. Joe's body is moved to the shuttle, but Paul struggles to accept her death's reality. Later, he rests before landing, recording messages. Again, he feels Joe is alive and even asks her not to breathe. He then contacts Houston, reports the body's damage, moves her from the ship to the station section, and locks her there. Preparing for undocking, the system fails. Mission Control reminds him that two people are needed to activate the system. Paul, like Joe in another reality, hits the console as a shadow approaches the inner control panel, and the system activates. The shuttle lands safely. Paul's family greets him, but he can't forget what happened, feeling guilty for leaving Joe's body on the ISS. He goes to her tree, laying flowers, and suddenly sees Joe before him. They stare at each other for a moment, then she vanishes. Later, Paul tells Joe's family how she died when he sees his portrait in a mourning frame. He's distracted by a question about visiting a psychologist and snaps back to reality. Later, the astronaut appears before the commission and recounts the experiment and the accident. Suddenly, the crew members object. They know nothing about a quantum physics experiment. That project was closed 12 years ago, and the order to leave Joe's body in orbit, it was his decision, not an order he received. Meanwhile, Alice is deeply affected by her mother's loss, constantly feeling that something is off. At the same time, Paul reviews footage from the Apollo 18 mission and is surprised to discover that 2 astronauts died during the launch under Henry Calder's command. He goes to his boss, but she only knows Pat Calder. There was no equipment and no Nobel Prize. The Apollo 18 mission was NASA's biggest failure. The man returns to his family and realizes that his wife's name is different from what he remembers. Later, his family goes to Joe's house for a memorial service, but Alice is hiding in the closet again, refusing to come out, convinced that her mother is alive. Seeing his crew, Paul doesn't want to enter the house, but his wife persuades him, though he admits everything feels wrong. Then his daughter brings Alice. He turns his head and sees another Alice screaming about what's happening in the living room. Joe rushes to the sound, seeing Alice from Paul's reality and trying to call out to her mother. Magnus takes his daughter away, and she asks to be taken to her mother's cabin. The next day, Magnus and Alice go to the lake house. At night, the father confesses he doesn't understand his daughter, who insists they will see their mother again. Meanwhile, Paul visits the house of Henry's twin brother, Pat, calling him Henry and stating that he conducted experiments under his direction. He wants to know the truth at any cost, but Pat pulls out a gun and shoots him. Alice sees a car approaching the cabin, and Joe gets out. And then everything gets confusing, so friends, forgive me if something is unclear. The girl hurriedly puts on her shoes and goes outside, but it's empty in front of the house. She calls for her mother, and Joe, in another reality, from the beginning of the film, turns at her voice but doesn't see her daughter. Alice returns to the house, puts on a coat, and goes out into the night with a flashlight. Joe distinctly hears footsteps passing by, but sees no one. They wander around the same place, shouting, hearing voices, but not seeing each other. In her reality, Joe and Alice sit in the cabin, listening to space recordings again. The girl admits her memories are different. Firstly, she doesn't speak Swedish. Also, her mother said Paul conducts experiments in the lab. The problem is the mother remembers nothing about this lab. She explains that the merging of 2 different realities is the result of a quantum experiment aiming to capture superposition, the moment when one thing exists in different places simultaneously. The girl suddenly confesses she feels Joe isn't her mother. Meanwhile, in another world, Magnus, accompanied by Henry and the police, heads to the lake house to retrieve Alice. Joe, stepping out to check the device, hears Alice's scream from the snowy field again. But her Alice is sleeping in the cabin. Joe runs outside again, heading towards the scream. At this time, parallel Alice finds a similar cabin, but it's cold and empty. Despite the building's similarities, the girl finds many discrepancies. For example, the picture on the wall is different. She goes upstairs and finds a closet. Hanging her necklace on the handle, Alice climbs inside. But the door suddenly slams shut, and the girl starts banging and calling for help. Joe, wandering through the field, also sees this cabin. She rushes to the banging and finds Alice. Joe carries the girl to her cabin, puts her in a hot bath, and admits that Alice smells like herself again. Stepping aside, Joe finds herself between 2 worlds, with Alice standing by the bed in one and the girl sitting in the bath in the other. Suddenly, the second Alice stops seeing Joe, gets out of the bath, and calls for her mother. But Magnus wakes up and runs to her. Alice admits she saw her mother, but now she's gone again. Joe, meanwhile, orders the second girl to get dressed and takes her to find the second cabin and the other Alice. Magnus's car is stopped by a blocked road, but the police inform him that a bulldozer is on the way. Alice asks her mother to come back, and Joe admits she doesn't belong to this world, urging them to figure out where the Joe from this reality went. Alice runs away, accusing her mother of madness. The second Alice goes to find the second cabin. Magnus follows her. The girl walks across the field, seeing a bead from her necklace in the snow. She follows the trail and finds a bag with a quantum device. Parallel Alice finds the second cabin. She enters, looks around, and takes an identical tape recorder, climbing into the closet. The second Alice also arrives at this closet and sees the tape recorder inside. The first Alice turns on the recorder and records her voice, calling Alice. The second Alice turns on the tape recorder and hears her own voice asking her to say something. While the girls establish contact, their parents search frantically through the frozen field and house. Jo finally reaches the closet. In her reality, Magnus approaches the same spot. Jo finds the tape recorder and hears the conversation between the two Alices. Magnus sees and hears the same thing. Terrified, he calls emergency services, reporting his daughter is missing at the lake. Jo gets into the car and heads towards the lake, as the kerosene lamp in her cabin falls and sets it on fire. The two Alices, sitting in the closet, look into the mirror and suddenly see each other. They say they are both looking for their mom. One Alice confesses that her mother died. At this moment, Jo notices the fire behind her. She turns the car around. The two Alices compare memories shared by Jo and conclude that their mothers switch places. Meanwhile, on the winter road, Henry Calder admits to Magnus that when he was on the moon, he thought his crew had died. But miraculously, they were alive. After returning to Earth, he started treatment. Rescuers finally arrive at the lake and start searching for Alice. Henry sees the fire blazing. Jo returns to the burning house, but upon entering, she finds no fire. However, the mirror reflects a burning room. Jo goes upstairs and finds her daughter in the closet, witnessing the conversation between the two Alices. Henry finds his quantum device stolen and lost by Jo. Jo hears the voice of the second Alice and sees her in the mirror. The girl asks her to come home, but Jo doesn't know how to do it. However, she promises to figure it out. She realizes the girls are dying, one in the fire, the other from the cold. She pulls the girl out and hands her to Henry, who has just arrived. Then she returns to the fire. Henry lays the girl in the snow and also calls for help, while Jo walks around the burning house. Suddenly, she sees Alice lying in the snow. She tries to revive her, hearing her voice behind. Turning around, she sees the second Alice, who suddenly says she doesn't feel her double. Apparently, the girl died, but Jo continues giving artificial respiration, believing she must save the girl. Suddenly, Magnus's voice calls out from the darkness. Jo tells her daughter to leave. Magnus sees his wife, unable to believe his eyes, and runs to her, finding his daughter. In the parallel reality, Jo revives the second Alice and starts looking for the second Alice. Rescuers grab her, thinking she's crazy. In the other world, Magnus brings Alice into the cabin, admitting he doesn't know what he saw. The injured Alice lies under an IV and suddenly hears a female voice promising to take her to her mom. The girl wakes up, seeing her father, who says Jo left with Irina. In reality, Jo is taken to a psychiatric clinic. Henry finds the tape recorder and listens to his report, discovering his colleagues are alive. He smashes his quantum device, destroying the experiment results. Magnus brings Alice home, and the girl says her mother is dead, her body still in space. Also, there is another Alice. Magnus tries to convince her that mom is alive, just not well right now. Meanwhile, a piano is brought to Jo's room. Henry is arrested for attempting to kill Paul and murdering a journalist on the ship. He requests his DNA be compared to the person who lived where Paul was shot. He's not Pat. The accuser suddenly says both men are actually the same person and shows a book written by Pat. Henry denies writing it, revealing that his so-called twin brother is actually his double from another reality. Later, Henry shows the broken device to Frederick, blaming Jo for damaging expensive equipment. He has long opposed sending women into space, believing their psyche is unstable. That night, Jo regains consciousness and tries to escape the clinic, but the door is locked. In the morning, Irina examines her, finding no mental disorders. Jo claims there was a fire in the cabin, and before that, she saw her real daughter. Irina asks her to play the piano and says her daughter is with her father. Jo is impossible to convince. Then Irina announces that Jo is pregnant. They couldn't give her lithium, as they never prescribe it to pregnant women, so they developed special vitamins for her, which Irina asks her to take. Jo is horrified and refuses. She can't have this child, because then she won't be able to return to her real life. Irina says there's another patient like her in the next room, but she won't be able to see him. Joe suddenly recognizes her as the dried-up mummy in space. She screams the word she heard on the recording, but Irina runs away. She calls Henry and asks for a meeting. Pat Calder is interrogated with a lie detector, denying shooting Paul, though he invented the machine that could cause an accident in space. Joe sits at the piano, but Ilya comes to her. She's very happy to see him, asking him to find out where Henry Calder is. But he suddenly starts convincing her that Joe is experiencing astronaut burnout, which fortunately is treatable. Joe repeats that the ISS collided with Irina's body. In that reality, it wasn't Paul who died, but her. Ilya doesn't believe her, and she asks him to leave. He says goodbye and secretly slips a key to her door, signaling that the room is bugged. Magnus tells the doctor he also saw Joe in the dark. Parallel. Magnus says he wants to get closer to this new Joe. Irina meets with Henry. He recalls her flight when she returned alive and unharmed, but years later he learned that Irina died in a space accident. She convinces him they both survived such accidents but returned, though they always felt another person nearby. Henry suddenly declares he's not Henry. He disappeared and won't return. He's the person who won the Nobel Prize. That night, Joe escapes her room, goes to the next room, and sees two identical old men. She returns to her room. The next day, Paul's daughter discusses a strange feeling with Alice. The girl feels her father's presence. Alice confesses that her mom is also halfway not here. In the parallel reality, Paul's daughter is puzzled by her father's strange behavior, who went to see a crazy old man and got shot. In both realities, Alice finishes talking to her friend and gets out of the closet. One asks her father to take her to mom in the hospital and pulls out a tape recorder. The other packs the deceased Joe's things and also finds a tape recorder. The girls simultaneously turn them on. When Joe in the hospital starts playing, they connect with each other. Later, the second Alice tells her father there's another Alice and promises she won't search for mom anymore. The prosecutor reports the complete identity of all tests, confirming that Pat and Henry are the same person, and presses charges. Sometime later, Irina comes to Joe, announcing there's only one person in the next room, the first one in space. She advises Joe to take the pills and return to life. She has a daughter and will have another child. She advises Joe to reconcile and move on. Later, Magnus and Alice arrive at the clinic. The girl talks about the other Alice and also advises her mother to accept what happened. She needs a mother, and Joe needs a daughter. So they will move on. Later, Joe shows Magnus their daughter's drawing, admitting she tries to be rational. She will return home and move on. They will have this child. Irina writes a letter admitting that since her flight, she has hidden the fact that space drives people crazy. She asks everyone who has experienced this to report it to her. At the clinic, Paul regains consciousness, unable to understand what he saw and experienced. Magnus takes Joe home, admitting she doesn't look like his wife. But they love each other and want to be a family. Irina says goodbye to Alice, admitting she has a second name, Valya. Meanwhile, on the orbiting ISS, Joe's mutilated body suddenly comes to life and catches a photo of herself with her daughter. This is where the first season ends. The story begins with a gripping and mysterious scenario. Ethan, a Secret Service agent from Seattle, regains consciousness in a forest after a car accident. Sporting a bruised face and feeling disoriented, he manages to make his way through the pine forest and finds himself in the seemingly peaceful town of Wayward Pines, Idaho. His appearance in town draws curious looks from passers-by, and upon entering a restaurant and collapsing from exhaustion, he learns from a waitress where he is. Ethan wakes up in a hospital bed in Wayward Pines, where a nurse named Pam tends to him, explaining he has minor injuries from the car accident. Distressed, Ethan inquires about his partner, Stallings, who was with him during the accident, only to learn of Stallings' tragic death. When he asks for his cell phone and belongings, he's advised they're at the police station, but he's encouraged to rest instead. Despite being the only patient in the hospital and against Pam's advice, Ethan leaves to go to the police station. There, he finds he can't access his belongings during the day, leading him to a nearby bar. Meanwhile, Ethan's boss Adam informs his wife Teresa that Ethan has been in an accident, but they haven't found his body yet. At the bar, Ethan borrows a phone from a waitress named Beverly to try and contact his family, but fails. Beverly empathizes with his situation, and it gives him her address in case he needs further help. He tells her his identity and that he is looking for two fellow agents, Evans and Kate, who is also Ethan's lover. Later, he notices her note mentioning the absence of crickets in Wayward Pines. On his way to the motel, he hears cricket sounds, but they are coming from a hidden speaker. The next morning, unable to pay for his hotel, Ethan visits Beverly's address only to find an abandoned cabin with the decaying body of Evans inside. Returning to the police station, he encounters an indifferent Sheriff Arnold who denies having Ethan's belongings and is unresponsive about the body. Ethan's attempts to make phone calls again prove fruitless. Back at the bar, Ethan finds a new operator and Beverly's mysterious absence. After an argument, Ethan is knocked unconscious. He wakes up in the hospital once more, this time restrained. Dr. Jenkins, a psychiatrist, insists on performing surgery due to a supposed blood clot. Despite Ethan's protests, injected with a sedative, he's left in the operating room. Surprisingly, Beverly rescues him, and together they knock out Pam and they escape the hospital. They reach a secluded wooden house where Beverly shares her own experience. She reveals she arrived in Wayward Pines in 1999, searching for an escape for a year. She also tells him she and Evans tried to escape, but he was killed. As Ethan falls under the sedative, he tells her it is actually 2014 now. Ethan wakes to find Beverly gone. Adam and investigators in Seattle are puzzled by the lack of evidence indicating Ethan's presence in the car during the accident. Meanwhile, in Wayward Pines, Ethan spots Kate, the other missing agent, at a nearby party. She appears older than he remembers, and Ethan cautiously follows her to a house that she enters with a man named Harold. When Ethan confronts Kate, she denies knowing him and warns him about the town's extensive surveillance with cameras and hidden microphones. Shockingly, she reveals she has been living in Wayward Pines for 12 years, leaving Ethan bewildered and alarmed. Determined to escape, Ethan steals a parked car, but his attempt to leave Wayward Pines is unsuccessful as he finds himself inexplicably back in town. Frustrated, he tries to flee on foot, only to be stopped by a massive electrified wall surrounding the town. Sheriff Arnold confronts him for the car theft and dismisses his claims of being a Secret Service agent. The next day, Ethan returns to the cabin where he found his colleague's body, still undisturbed. He discovers a mysterious notebook in his friend's boot, but is interrupted by Arnold, who arrives with a gun, claiming a forensic team is coming. Ethan is forced to leave and heads back to the hotel. At the bar, he unexpectedly encounters Beverly again. She covertly arranges a secret meeting and gives him money, hinting at a plan involving Evans's notebook. Using the money, Ethan visits a cafe and manages to call the Secret Service, only to realize the operator is an imposter. He becomes suspicious when the cashier hastily takes the banknote from him. Later, Ethan tries to connect with Kate at the toy store where she works. Despite his efforts, Kate remains distant and secretive, adhering to the town's strict rules against discussing the past. Ethan's confusion deepens when he visits Evans's home, where Evans's wife denies knowing him and claims she witnessed her husband's suicide. Seeking answers, Ethan confronts Arnold, who instructs him to stay at the hotel and informs him that Evans's body has been sent to the morgue. At the morgue, Ethan retrieves the notebook from Evans's clothes. In a startling turn, Ethan sees his wife, Teresa, and son, Ben, being brought into the hospital on stretchers, but he can't find them anywhere. Dr. Jenkins warns Ethan that his condition is deteriorating and insists he needs surgery immediately. Back in Seattle, Teresa grows increasingly anxious about Ethan's whereabouts, with their son Ben suspecting Ethan might have run away with Kate. When she contacts Adam for information, he assures her of his efforts, but explains that the details are confidential, deepening the mystery and concern for Ethan's fate. night, the tension escalates as Ethan continues to unravel the mysteries of the town. He meets Beverly at their agreed location in Pine Forest, where she reveals that a tracking device has been implanted in him. Together, they remove the device in a secluded stone house. Beverly also shares the harrowing truth that Sheriff Arnold publicly executed Evans as a warning to the town. Ethan later meets Kate again, and despite his reservations, accepts an invitation to dinner at her house with Beverly. Anticipating surveillance, he cleverly leaves the tracking chip on his hotel bed and sets out to find a package hidden in the Pine Forest, as indicated by a map inside Evans's belongings. After successfully retrieving the package, Ethan observes Arnold firing a gunshot from a distance at Kate's house. While Beverly nervously remains at the dining table, Ethan searches the bathroom for surveillance devices. Beverly inadvertently mentions her daughter, a violation of the town's strict rules. Realizing her mistake, she excuses herself, leading to a tense situation as all the phones in the town ring simultaneously, signaling their exposure. Ethan and Beverly hastily leave, evading the crowd, now alerted to their actions. In the cemetery, Ethan instructs Beverly to retrieve the agent's package while he draws the crowd away. However, Beverly is captured by the townspeople. Ethan, hiding in a nearby house, witnesses a chilling scene where Beverly is dragged onto a stage before an excited crowd. Arnold incites the crowd to punish Beverly for her attempt to escape, and she is brutally executed in front of the onlookers, including Ethan. Meanwhile, Ethan's wife Teresa and their son Ben travel to Idaho to investigate Ethan's disappearance. They arrive at the Secret Service field headquarters in Boise, Idaho, where Ethan was last reported. While there, Teresa uncovers a lead to Wayward Pines. As Teresa and Ben near the town, they are pulled over by Sheriff Pope, who sabotages their car under the guise of fixing an oil leak. The following morning, Ethan stumbles upon a truck loaded with supplies, indicating a connection to the outside world. He hides in the truck's cargo hold, eventually emerging in a well-lit warehouse filled with workers and abandoned vehicles, including one that belongs to his wife, Teresa. Inside Teresa's car, he discovers personal items belonging to her and Ben, adding to his desperation and confusion about his family's whereabouts and safety. The plot takes a dramatic turn as Ethan's situation grows increasingly mysterious. As Ethan explores the warehouse, Sheriff Arnold suddenly appears, attacking him with a sedative. Ethan loses consciousness and later wakes up in a hospital bed. The nurse there informs him that his wife Teresa and son Ben have been brought to Wayward Pines and are now living in Beverly's former house. Despite his disbelief, Ethan goes to visit his family, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension about their safety in the town. He cautions Teresa against wandering or communicating with anyone, even over the phone, aware of the town's oppressive surveillance. Ethan then confronts Arnold and Nurse Pam at the police station, demanding to know why his family was brought to Wayward Pines. Arnold insists it's for their happiness, but Ethan, unconvinced and furious, presses for more answers. Their heated exchange is interrupted by a mysterious phone call, hinting that Arnold is merely a pawn in a larger scheme controlled by an unknown mastermind. Outside the police station, Ethan encounters Dr. Jenkins, who advises him to abandon any thoughts of escape. Ethan, however, firmly states he doesn't belong in Wayward Pines. Seeking more insight, Ethan meets with Kate in the Pine Forest, away from the prying eyes of surveillance cameras. However, Ben follows his father and witnesses the meeting, prompting him to rush home and inform Teresa. Kate explains to Ethan that after spending 12 years in Wayward Pines, she has resigned herself to the town's rules as the only means of survival. Upon returning home, Ethan is shocked to find his family missing, with only Teresa's wedding ring left behind. Frantically searching for them, he discovers them near the isolation wall, where Arnold is threatening them with a gun. In a tense confrontation, Ethan struggles with Arnold, and Ben intervenes by hitting Arnold with a car. As Arnold lays dying, he cryptically warns Ethan that the truth is far worse than he can imagine. Ethan, taking the key to the isolation wall, opens the gate, only for a strange figure to snatch Arnold's body, accompanied by a creepy noise. Ethan quickly closes the gate and escapes with his family. Back at home, the family is deeply shaken. Ethan advises them to pretend to lead a normal life while they plan their escape. The next day, a mailman delivers a letter to Ben, welcoming him to Wayward Pine Academy, along with a uniform. Ethan, in need of a gun, visits the police station only to encounter the mayor, Brad, who warns him to follow the town's rules and avoid asking questions. Ethan is also congratulated on becoming the new sheriff, complete with a cake and a newspaper announcing Arnold's retirement. Reluctantly, Ethan plays along. Meanwhile, Ben attends Wayward Pine Academy, where he meets his teacher Megan, who is also the mayor's wife and a therapist specializing in molding the children's minds. Ethan, continuing his investigation, discovers hidden files on the town's residents, nudging him to delve deeper into the secrets of Wayward Pines. Soon after, the tension within the town continues to escalate. The residents capture a man named McCall, who is accused of spreading harmful ideas on walls. Nurse Pam pushes for a public execution the following night, but Ethan, now acting as the sheriff, strongly opposes it. In his office, Ethan interrogates McCall, but is interrupted by a phone call, leading him to reluctantly agree to execute McCall the next night. That evening, Ethan's son Ben sneaks out with his school friend Amy, indicating the younger generation's growing curiosity and defiance. Meanwhile, Ethan and Teresa have dinner at a local restaurant with the mayor and his wife Megan, where other town residents, including Pam, Kate, and her husband, are also dining. The celebration for the new sheriff follows, during which Pam takes the opportunity to congratulate Ethan, but also stresses the importance of upholding the town's strict rules. Ethan, feeling the weight of his new role, publicly declares his commitment to rooting out true evil in Wayward Pines. After the dinner, Ethan asks Teresa to return home, while he attempts to secretly help McCall escape from the cell. However, McCall suggests they head towards the isolation wall instead. At a cliff near the wall, McCall reflects on its purpose, whether it's meant to keep the residents in, or something from the outside out. In a moment of desperation, McCall embraces Ethan and then runs into the electrified wall, sacrificing himself in a bid for freedom. Teresa, meanwhile, receives a letter stating she can now work at the Wayward Pines Realty Associates, McCall's previous workplace. Ethan, determined to leave Wayward Pines, packs weapons and successfully climbs the cliff. However, he soon realizes he's being watched by a strange figure. As night falls, a dark shadow attacks him, injuring his arm. Despite firing his gun, Ethan is unable to fend off the swift creature. The next morning, Ethan prepares to navigate the pine forest, hoping to find help from the nearest city. In the town, Ben finds his new school unsettlingly perfect. While Teresa starts her new job at the realty office, she's assigned to assist a new resident, Wayne, who appears confused and disoriented. Sensing a shared experience, Teresa offers her help and discreetly inquires about his past. However, their conversation is interrupted by Pam. Later, Teresa takes Wayne to a house under the guise of giving a tour. Using the noise of a dryer as cover, she warns him about the surveillance in Wayward Pines. She learns from Wayne that he remembers waking up in a chamber, surrounded by others in a similar situation. Meanwhile, Ben and two new students are called to a closed, all-white room for orientation. Megan, the teacher and mayor's wife, begins the session, hinting that they are about to learn the hidden truths of Wayward Pines. Teacher Megan reveals a disturbing image of a hairless, monstrous humanoid creature evolved from humans in a dominant predator known as Abby, short for an aberrant. She explains that these creatures, Abbies, travel in herds, with the lunch break offering the students a brief respite to process this revelation. The session resumes. Each student receives an ancient coin dated 2095, leading teacher Morgan to reveal a startling fact. The current year is not 2014, as they believed, but 4028. She explains that their supposed accidents were actually deliberate selections to bring them to Wayward Pines. The residents, including the students, have been in hibernation chambers for over 2 millennia, chosen by the program's creator, David, who Megan says is always watching over them, though they will never meet him. Ethan, feeling a constant sense of surveillance, ventures into the woods. He cleverly uses an animal carcass to mask his scent and observes the Abbies. His journey through the pine forest leads him to the ruins of human civilization, confirming Teacher Megan's revelations. Unexpectedly, he encounters a helicopter and meets Dr. Jenkins, who reveals himself as David, the architect of Wayward Pines. David urges Ethan to return to town promptly. My friends, the continuation of the story is now on the screen in front of you.